Cora Halloran dropped her 2 carpet-bags in the dirt of the ranch yard. The dust, fine as milled flour, rose in a soft, tired puff around the worn leather, then settled again under the indifferent blue of the Montana sky. Beside her, her son Leo stood as still and silent as a fence post, his small hand clutching a fold of her brown skirt. He did not look at the ramshackle collection of buildings, the long, low bunkhouse, the sway-backed barn, the main house that seemed to be hunkering down against the wind. He looked only at his mother's face, his eyes searching for a map of what to do next. Cora offered him none. Her own gaze was fixed on the man who had just emerged from the largest of the structures, wiping his hands on a rag. He was tall and broad in the shoulder, but he moved with the weariness of a man who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. His hair was the color of salt and pepper, mostly salt, and his eyes, even from this distance, looked like creek stones after a rain, hard, gray, and washed clean of any warmth. This had to be him, Elias Thorne, the owner of the Stony Creek Ranch, and her last hope. She had walked the final 6 miles from the dusty crossroads where the mail wagon had let her off. Every step had been a negotiation between the grit in her worn-out boots and the dwindling reserve of her strength. She had $2, a silver locket with a portrait of her late husband, and the boy. That was the sum total of the world she had left. But desperation was a luxury she had packed away months ago, along with her wedding dress and Tom's books. What she carried now was a colder, harder thing: resolve. The man, Thorne, stopped about 20 feet away. He tossed the rag onto a porch railing and crossed his arms. It was not a welcoming posture. It was the posture of a man guarding a fortress, however dilapidated it might be. "This is private property," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like distant rockfall. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact and an order to depart. Cora took a shallow breath, the high country air thin and sharp in her lungs. It smelled of pine and dust and distant cattle. "I know," she said. Her own voice was steady, clearer than she felt. "I'm looking for Mr. Elias Thorne." "You've found him," the man said, his eyes narrowing. He looked at her, a long, slow appraisal that took in the dust on her dress, the exhaustion etched around her eyes, the protective way her hand rested on her son's shoulder. He looked at the boy, who stared back with an unnerving stillness, then his gaze returned to her. It was a look she had come to know well on her journey west, a mixture of suspicion and a flicker of pity he would never admit to. "I'm not hiring, and the church in town handles charity." Cora felt a familiar, bitter tightening in her chest. She had heard variations of that sentence in 3 territories, but she did not let it show on her face. She had learned that the world had little time for a woman's grief, but it sometimes had a grudging respect for her spine. She took a step forward, leaving the bags and the boy where they were. "I'm not asking for charity," she said, her voice dropping to a register that matched his for seriousness. "And I'm not looking to be hired in the way you mean. My name is Cora Halloran. My husband and I ran a spread in the Panhandle for 10 years. He's gone now, and so is the ranch. What I am is a woman who knows her work. I can cook for 20 hands or 2. I can mend clothes, harnesses, and tack. I can manage a garden that will feed a house through winter, and I can keep a set of books so clean and honest you could read them in church." She paused, letting the words settle in the space between them. "I'm not looking for a handout, Mr. Thorne. I'm offering a bargain. You need help. I need a roof. I will give you more value in labor than you will give me in board." He listened without a single change in his expression. The skepticism was a wall he had built brick by brick over many years. She could see the faint lines around his eyes, the permanent set of his mouth. This was a man who had been disappointed by the world and by the people in it more times than he could count. He was not a cruel man, she judged. He was a tired one. "A woman and a boy," he said, as if weighing the words in his hand. "This is a hard place. No place for a child. No place for—" He trailed off, but she knew the word he had stopped himself from saying. "A lady." He was wrong. She had stopped being a lady the day she'd had to sell her last good pair of gloves for 3 pounds of flour. "The world is a hard place, Mr. Thorne," Cora replied quietly. "We will not be a burden. My boy is quiet, and he knows how to keep out from underfoot. I am not." She met his gaze directly. "I will earn our keep, every meal, every stitch, every entry in your ledger." From the corner of the yard, 2 men had stopped their work to watch. One was older, wiry, with a suspicious squint. The other was younger, barely out of his teens, his face open and curious. The older one muttered something to the younger, who just shook his head and kept watching. Elias Thorne looked from Cora to the boy, then at the vast empty landscape that surrounded them, a landscape that could swallow a person whole. He seemed to be calculating not just the cost of feeding 2 extra mouths, but the cost of the disruption, the cost of the hope she was trying to sell him, a commodity he had long since stopped trading in. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred. He looked at the house, in need of paint and repair. He looked at the whole weary enterprise of his life. Just as he opened his mouth to deliver the final inevitable refusal, a shout cut through the afternoon quiet. "Boss! It's Agamemnon! He's in the creek wire!" Thorne's head snapped toward the sound. A new kind of energy, sharp and urgent, shot through him. "Jed, damn it!" he yelled, already moving. The 2 hands were running toward the creek that gave the ranch its name. Thorne broke into a heavy ground-eating run himself. Cora did not hesitate. "Leo, you stay right here by the bags. Do not move," she commanded in a low, firm voice. He nodded, his eyes wide. She gathered her skirts and ran, not with the panic of the men, but with the focused stride of someone moving toward a problem that needed solving. She reached the creek bank just behind Thorne. The scene was one of controlled chaos. A massive Hereford bull, a magnificent animal with a chest like a barrel and horns like polished cypress, was tangled in a half-submerged coil of old barbed wire. Every time he thrashed, the barbs dug deeper into his hide and his powerful legs. He was bellowing, a sound of pain and fury, churning the shallow water into a muddy froth. The wiry hand, Jed, was trying to get a rope around the bull's horns, while the younger one, Billy, danced at the edge of the water, unsure how to help without getting gored or trampled. "Get the wire cutters," Thorne roared, but Jed shook his head, breathing hard. "Can't get close enough, boss. He'll kill anyone who tries." The bull lunged, and Jed scrambled back up the muddy bank, falling hard. The animal was panicking, tightening the wire's grip with every move. He was going to lame himself, or worse. Thorne stood, his face a mask of frustration. That bull was his prize, the future of his herd. He was worth more than the bunkhouse and everything in it. Cora's eyes took in the situation in a single, sweeping glance. The wire, the bull's position, the fear in the men, the panicked energy of the animal. She remembered her father, a man who believed you could reason with any animal if you just understood what it was afraid of. She saw a length of thick rope lying discarded near a fence post. She walked past Thorne, her boots sinking into the soft earth at the creek's edge. He turned to bark at her, to order her back, but the words died in his throat. There was no fear on her face. There was only an intense, unnerving focus. "We're not trying to fight him," she said, her voice cutting through the men's frantic shouts. It was not loud, but it had the quality of command. "We're trying to help him. He needs to know that." She picked up the rope. She didn't approach the bull's head. She moved downstream, wading into the cold creek water without a pause. The water soaked the hem of her dress, chilling her to the bone, but she paid it no mind. She moved slowly, deliberately, talking in a low, steady monotone. "Easy now, big fellow, easy. Just a bit of a tangle. We'll get you out." The bull's frantic eye rolled toward her. He snorted, a hot plume of breath misting in the air, but her calm, steady approach was so different from the men's panicked energy that it seemed to confuse him. He quieted for a second, watching her. "Billy," she said, not taking her eyes off the bull. The young hand startled, as if surprised she knew his name, though he'd never spoken it. "Your lariat. Make a wide loop, but don't throw it. Just hold it ready." She continued her slow, careful path until she was behind the bull's massive flank. He couldn't easily kick backward in the thick mud, and his head was still tangled. It was the safest and most unexpected place to be. With a series of movements so deft and practiced, they seemed like a single motion. She looped her rope around the bull's back leg high above the hock and pulled it taut, bracing her feet in the creek bed. "Jed!" she called out, her voice still calm. "Take the other end of this rope. Walk it straight back to that cottonwood. Don't pull, just hold the slack." Jed, looking dumbfounded, scrambled to do as she said. Thorne watched, his mouth slightly agape. What she was doing was creating an anchor, a line of control that didn't involve the animal's head and its panicked instinct to fight. "Now, Mr. Thorne," she said, looking at him for the first time since she had entered the water. "He's anchored. He can't swing his hindquarters. He can't charge you. Walk to him. Talk to him. Cut the wire." It was a moment of pure transference. She had taken control of the situation, not with force, but with intelligence. She had analyzed the problem, devised a solution, and issued clear, concise orders. She had handed the final heroic act back to him, the owner. Elias Thorne stared at her for a heartbeat. He saw the water dripping from her skirt, the mud staining her hands, the absolute certainty in her gray eyes. He saw a competence so profound it was like a force of nature. He broke his paralysis. He grabbed the wire cutters from Billy and waded into the creek, talking to the bull in the same low, calming tone she had used. The bull flinched, but the rope on his back leg held him steady. He couldn't bolt. He couldn't turn to fight. He was trapped, but he was also, strangely, secure. With two sharp snaps, the wire parted. The bull stood for a moment, trembling, as if realizing he was free. Thorne unwrapped the last of the wire from his leg. "All right, Jed," Cora said quietly. "Let the rope go." Jed dropped his end. Cora unlooped hers. The bull took a hesitant step, then another. He shook his massive head, looked at the humans with a final, confused snort, and then lumbered out of the creek and up the far bank, moving slowly but without a significant limp. He was saved. Silence descended on the creek bank, broken only by the sound of dripping water and the men's heavy breathing. Jed stared at Cora as if she were a ghost. Billy had a look of pure, unadulterated awe on his young face. Elias Thorne walked out of the water, the wire cutters dangling from his hand. He stopped in front of her. He looked at the saved bull, now grazing peacefully 100 yards away. He looked at his men who had been rendered useless by their own panic. He looked at this woman, this stranger, who stood shivering in the cold creek, her dress ruined, her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes clear and direct. He had been prepared to say no. He had been prepared to send her on her way with $1 for her trouble and a clear conscience. But the world had just turned upside down. Competence was a language he understood better than any other, and this woman spoke it more fluently than anyone he had met in a decade. Clear his throat. He cleared his throat. The sound was rough. "The east room in the house is empty," he said, not looking at her but at the mountains in the distance. "It's small, but it's warm. The kitchen is yours in the morning, biscuits at dawn." It was not an apology. It was not a welcome. It was a contract. Cora nodded once, a small, sharp movement of her head. "And the books?" Thorne finally met her eyes. For the first time, she saw something other than weariness there. It was a flicker of grudging respect, a spark in the gray stones. "The books are on the desk in my office," he said. "They're a mess." He turned and walked back toward the house without another word. It was not a dismissal. It was an acceptance. Cora watched him go. Then she turned to her son, who had not moved, his small form a fixed point in the chaotic afternoon. She walked out of the creek, her wet skirt heavy around her legs, and went to him. She knelt, ignoring the cold and the mud, and smoothed his hair back from his forehead. "It's all right, Leo," she whispered, her voice for his ears alone. "We have a place. For a little while." He did not speak, but he leaned his forehead against hers, a small, warm pressure that was both an anchor and a reason. She had not found a home. Not yet. But she had earned a foothold on the edge of a cliff. For now, it was enough. She picked up the 2 carpet bags, their weight familiar and grounding, and followed the path Elias Thorne had taken toward the house that was, for the next 30 days, their sanctuary. The first proof of her bargain came not with a ledger or a mended fence, but with the smell of baking bread. Before the sun had even thought about cresting the jagged peaks to the east, Cora was in the kitchen. It was a dispiriting space. A film of old grease coated the surfaces. The floor was scuffed and stained, and the pantry was a study in chaos, sacks of flour slumped against tins of lard, a sticky residue of molasses on one shelf, and the faint, sad smell of weevils. For a moment, standing in the dim light of her lantern, the sheer scale of the neglect was overwhelming. It was more than just a messy kitchen. It was a symptom of the ranch's deeper malaise. It was the physical manifestation of weariness, of a place run by men who had lost the heart for the small things that make a place a home. But then she saw the cast iron stove, It was an old, magnificent beast, a monarch model with 6 burners and a warming oven. It was black with soot and rust, but she could see it was sound. It had good bones. Like the ranch, perhaps. She did not start with the meal. She started with the kitchen itself. With a bucket of hot water and a block of harsh lye soap, she began to scrub. She worked with an unhurried, methodical rhythm that was the very antithesis of panic. First, the stovetop, scraping away layers of carbonized grease until the black iron shone with a dull luster. Then, the long plank table where the men ate, scrubbing it down to the bare, pale wood. She found a half-empty sack of flour that was still good, a tin of baking soda, and a crock of sourdough starter, miraculously still alive, tucked away in a cool corner. By the time the first gray light filtered through the grimy window pane, the air in the kitchen was transformed. The old stale smells were gone, replaced by the clean scents of lye and hot iron, and then, gloriously, by the tangy, yeasty aroma of sourdough biscuits browning in the oven. She put a massive pot of coffee on to boil and fried thick slices of bacon, rendering the fat to cook a pan of scrambled eggs. The men shuffled in one by one, their faces still thick with sleep. They stopped just inside the door, blinking. Jed was the first. He looked around the room, his eyes moving from the clean table to the gleaming stove, to the platter of perfectly browned biscuits. His perpetual squint deepened. He seemed to be looking for something to criticize, something out of place, but could find nothing. He was followed by Billy, whose face broke into a slow, wondering smile. Then came Silas, the old, quiet hand. He sniffed the air, a long, deliberate inhalation, and a look of something approaching contentment settled on his weathered face. They took their seats at the clean table in silence. Cora moved quietly, placing the platter of biscuits, the bowl of eggs, and the plate of bacon in the center. She filled their tin mugs with steaming black coffee. No one spoke. The only sounds were the clink of forks against plates and the soft, appreciative grunts of men eating their first decent meal in months, maybe years. Cora did not sit with them. She took a plate for herself and Leo and ate standing by the stove, watching. She saw the way Billy reached for a third biscuit, the way Silas carefully sopped up the last of his egg with a piece of bacon. She saw Jed eat everything on his plate, his movements stiff with a reluctance to admit how good it was. Food was a language, and she was fluent. This meal was her opening statement. It said, "I am not what you think. I bring order, I bring comfort, I am capable." Elias Thorne came in last. He stopped in the doorway, just as the men had, and surveyed the scene. His gaze swept the room, noting the changes, the clean surfaces, the organized pantry visible through the open door, the smell. He looked at the men eating at his table. They were quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the usual sullen morning silence. This was a peaceable quiet. He looked at Cora, standing by the stove, a sentinel in her domain. Her face was calm, her posture erect. She met his eyes for a second, then looked away, turning her attention to the dishes. He took his seat at the head of the table. He poured himself a cup of coffee. He took a biscuit from the platter. He broke it open. The steam rose from it, carrying the scent of sourdough and care. He took a bite. His expression did not change, but he closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. It was a taste he remembered from his childhood, from a time before the weariness had set in. He ate his breakfast in silence, the same as his men. But when he was finished, he pushed his chair back and stood. "Jed," he said, his voice flat. "After morning chores, you and Billy will clear out the old tack room. Make space. Mr. Halloran's supplies are coming in on the wagon Friday." He had almost said Mrs. Halloran's, but corrected himself. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift. He was giving her a space, a territory. "Silas, check the roof on the north barn. Looks like we've got weather coming." Then he looked toward the stove. "Mrs. Halloran," he said, the name formal and correct. "The ledgers are in the office. The key is on the hook by the door." He left. The order was given. The proof was accepted. Cora felt a small, quiet unwinding in her chest. She'd passed the first test. She cleaned the breakfast dishes, her movements economical and sure. She banked the fire in the stove, saving the coals. She wasted nothing. Every scrap of bacon grease was saved, every crumb swept up. This was not just tidiness, it was the grammar of survival, a set of rules learned in a hard school. Later that morning, with Leo playing quietly with a set of carved wooden blocks she had brought in one of the bags, she let herself into Elias Thorne's office. It was, like the kitchen had been, a room that spoke of a man overwhelmed. Papers were stacked in precarious piles on every surface. The desk was a battlefield of old invoices, letters, and catalogs, all dusted with a fine layer of neglect. The ledgers themselves were on a shelf, 3 thick leather-bound volumes. She sat in the creaking chair, pulled the first ledger toward her, and opened it. The pages were filled with Thorne's heavy masculine script. The numbers were there, but they were a chaotic jumble. Entries were crossed out, notes were scribbled in the margins, and there was no system of cross-referencing. It was the accounting of a man who hated accounting, who did it as a necessary evil before getting back to the real work of the ranch. Cora took a deep breath. This was not like calming a panicked bull or baking bread. This was a different kind of tangle, a different kind of neglect, but the principle was the same. Find the beginning of the knot. Work it loose, one thread at a time. She took a blank sheet of paper and a pencil. She wrote at the top, year-to-date expenses, feed, and grain. Then she began her work, her head bent in concentration, her pencil moving with a quiet, steady scratch. She was not just counting numbers, she was excavating the story of the Stony Creek Ranch, a story of struggle and loss and stubborn, weary survival. And as she worked, a quiet sense of purpose settled over her. She was no longer just a supplicant. She was a part of the machine, a vital cog that had just begun to turn. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the seasons of work on the ranch. Cora's presence began to thread itself into the fabric of the place, subtly at first, then with undeniable strength. The first to truly see it was Billy. He was young, with a face that hadn't yet learned to hide what he was thinking. He saw the way Cora's hands, though reddened from lye soap and hot water, moved with a gentle precision as she patched his favorite shirt, the tear disappearing into a seam so neat it was almost invisible. He started finding reasons to be near the main house. He'd bring in an extra armload of firewood for the kitchen stove, his excuse being that he was passing by anyway. He'd linger after meals, helping her clear the heavy plates from the table. It was during one of these moments that he first spoke to Leo. The boy was sitting on the floor by the hearth, arranging a line of smooth gray stones he had collected from the creek. "That's a fine-looking wall you're building there, little man," Billy said, crouching down. Leo looked up, his eyes wide and startled, and quickly gathered the stones into his lap as if caught doing something wrong. "He doesn't talk much," Cora said softly from the sink, not turning around. Her voice was gentle, an explanation, not an apology. "That's all right," Billy said, still speaking to the boy. "A man ain't measured by how much he talks, but by what he builds, and that's a good, straight line of stones." He smiled, a wide, guileless grin. He didn't press for a response. He just stood up and went back to helping Cora. But the next day, when Billy came into the kitchen, Leo didn't hide his stones. He simply watched the young cowboy with his large, silent eyes. An alliance was being formed, one built not on words, but on the simple currency of kindness. Silas, the old hand, was the next to capitulate, though his surrender was as quiet as the man himself. He was a man of few words and deep observations. He noticed things. He noticed that the coffee was now consistently strong and hot, not the boiled-down sludge Jed used to make. He noticed that the stores in the pantry were organized, the sacks of beans and flour tied shut against mice. He noticed that the mending pile, which had been a permanent fixture in the corner of the bunkhouse, had vanished. One evening, after a supper of rich beef stew and thick cornbread, Silas was the last to leave the table. He paused by the stove where Cora was washing a large pot. He held out his hand. In his palm was a small, intricately carved bird, whittled from a piece of cottonwood bark. The detail was astonishing. He pushed it across the stovetop toward her. "For the boy," he mumbled, his voice a gravelly whisper unused to conversation. Cora dried her hands and picked up the bird. It was warm from his hand. She looked at the old man, at his face, which was a roadmap of sun and wind and time. "It's beautiful, Silas," she said, her voice thick with an emotion that surprised her. "Thank you." He gave a single sharp nod, a gesture that conveyed more than a paragraph of polite conversation. He turned and left. It was a gift, but it was also a verdict. In his silent, watchful judgment, she had been deemed worthy. But not everyone was won over. Jed saw Cora's growing influence not as a benefit to the ranch, but as a threat to his own standing. He had been with Elias for 15 years. He had been the de facto head of the bunkhouse, the one who set the tone. Now, there was a new center of gravity on the ranch, and it was in the kitchen. The men's quiet praise for Cora's cooking felt like a criticism of his own. The order she brought to the house highlighted the chaos he had presided over. His resentment began to curdle into open hostility. He started making small, cutting remarks, loud enough for her to hear. "Wasting good sugar on a pie when we should be saving," he'd mutter as he walked past the kitchen. Or, "Place is starting to smell like a damn perfumery," when she had a pot of herbs simmering to freshen the air. Cora ignored him. She had dealt with men like Jed before, men whose pride was as brittle as old leather, who saw any change as a personal affront. Arguing with him would be like wrestling a pig. You'd both get dirty, and the pig would like it. Her work was her only necessary response. The confrontation she'd been expecting came on a Tuesday. She had spent the morning baking, and the kitchen was filled with the warm, sweet scent of cinnamon and apples. She'd found a crate of apples in the root cellar, slightly withered but still good, and decided a pie would be a welcome break from the relentless diet of beans and bacon the men were used to. It was a calculated risk, a small expenditure for a large return in morale. She was rolling out the last of the pie crust on the floured tabletop when Jed filled the doorway. He had a thunderous look on his face. He'd just come from the pantry, where he'd seen the depleted bin of flour and the empty sugar sack. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice loud and accusatory. "Wasting our supplies on fripperies. We've got a long winter ahead, and you're baking sweets like it's a church social." Cora did not stop working the dough. She continued to press it out with the heavy wooden rolling pin, her movements smooth and even. Leo, who had been sitting by the fire, grew very still. "It's not a waste, Jed," she said, her voice level. "It's an investment." "An investment?" He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "That's a fine word for it. The boss is too soft-hearted to see it, but I ain't. You come here with nothing, and now you're living off the fat of the land, playing lady of the manor." He took a step into the kitchen, his posture aggressive. He was trying to intimidate her, to use his size and his anger to cow her. Cora finally stopped her work. She rested her hands on the rolling pin where it lay on the dough. Her knuckles were white. She looked at him, and her gray eyes were as cold and hard as river stones. "I have wasted nothing," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I have stretched the flour you and others let the weevils get to. I've used the apples that were about to rot in the cellar. This pie cost this ranch less than the pound of bacon you burned last Thursday. A crew works on its stomach, but it runs on its spirit. A small comfort now and then is not a luxury. It's maintenance. It keeps men from getting sour and mean-spirited." She paused, letting the final words hang in the air, a direct and pointed dart. Jed's face flushed a dark, mottled red. He was about to retort, to escalate the confrontation, when a shadow fell across the doorway. Elias Thorne stood there. He had been in his office, the door slightly ajar, and had heard the entire exchange. He looked at Jed's furious face. He looked at Cora standing her ground behind the table, her hands resting on a tool of her trade, her expression one of steely calm. He looked at the half-made pie, and he could smell the sweet, comforting promise of it in the air. He remembered the years of burnt food and sullen meals. He remembered the taste of the biscuit on that first morning. "Jed," Elias said, his voice low and laced with an unmistakable thread of command, "is there a fence that needs mending? Or have you finished all your work for the day?" Jed was momentarily struck dumb. He turned to his boss, his mouth opening and closing. He had expected Thorne to side with him, his long-time hand. He had expected him to put the woman, the outsider, in her place. "But boss," he stammered, "the supplies." "Mrs. Halloran is in charge of the kitchen and the pantry," Elias said, cutting him off. His tone was final. "Her accounting of it is her own business, and mine. Yours is to see to the cattle." He held Jed's gaze for a long moment. "Go see to the cattle." It was a public dressing down, a clear and unequivocal statement of support. The authority Jed had tried to challenge was not just Cora's, it was Elias's, and Elias had just reinforced it with steel. Defeated, Jed turned without another word and stalked out of the kitchen, his shoulders stiff with humiliation. The room was silent again. Cora slowly let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands relaxed on the rolling pin. She did not look at Elias. She went back to her dough, her movements a little less steady than before. Elias stepped into the kitchen. He walked over to the stove and poured himself a cup of coffee. He leaned against the wall, sipping it, watching her deftly place the top crust on the pie and crimp the edges. "He's been with me a long time," Elias said quietly, as if speaking to the wall. "He's loyal, but he's resistant to new methods." Cora cut a vent in the top of the pie, a perfect clean slit. "Change is a threat to men who have only ever known one way of doing things," she said. Elias nodded, taking another sip of coffee. He looked at the small boy by the fire, who was now cautiously resuming his play with the stones. He looked at the woman who had faced down his angriest hand without raising her voice. He had hired her to cook and keep books. He was beginning to understand that he had gotten something far more valuable. He had gotten an ally. "The pie smells good," he said, a statement of fact that felt like a peace treaty. "It will be ready after supper," she replied. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug at the basin, and left her to her work. The balance of power on the Stony Creek Ranch had shifted, not with a gunshot, but with a quiet conversation over an unbaked apple pie. And in the quiet aftermath, Cora felt a new kind of security take root. She was no longer just on trial. She was defended. She was part of the fort. Cora's work on the ledgers was a slow, painstaking archaeology. Night after night, after Leo was asleep and the house was quiet, she would sit at Thorne's desk, a single lamp casting a pool of yellow light on the pages. She was not merely correcting his chaotic arithmetic. She was learning the secret history of the ranch's decline. She saw the years of drought reflected in the diminished sales of cattle. She saw the rising costs of freight from the east. But she also saw something else, a small, persistent leak that, over the years, had become a hemorrhage. It was in the invoices from the ranch's primary supplier in Miles City, a firm called Dawson Mercantile. For years, Elias had bought all his bulk supplies from them: grain for the cattle, flour and sugar for the bunkhouse, salt licks, tools, even the despised tins of beans. The prices seemed to rise every year, a little at a time, which Elias had likely attributed to inflation or hard times. But Cora saw a pattern. She cross-referenced the invoices with old price lists she found in a dusty stack of periodicals. The discrepancies were small at first, a few cents on a sack of flour, $1 on a barrel of salted fish, but they were consistent, and in the last 2 years, they had grown bolder. She spent 3 nights confirming her suspicions. She created a new set of columns on a fresh sheet of paper: date, item, Dawson price, catalog price, difference. The final column was a testament to a slow, methodical theft. Over 5 years, Elias Thorne had been overcharged by a sum that made Cora's breath catch in her throat. It was enough to have paid for 2 good hands for a full year. It was the difference between scraping by and getting ahead. The supplier, a man named Henderson, who signed each invoice with a florid, confident hand, was not a partner in business. He was a parasite. But she found something else, too. While searching for the original deed to the property to verify its boundaries, she had stumbled upon a folder of Elias's father's papers. Tucked inside was a water rights agreement drawn up 50 years prior when the valley was first settled. It was a document, brittle with age, that clearly stated that the water from Stony Creek was to be shared between the Thorne Ranch and the one downstream. But it specified that the Thorne Ranch, being upstream, had primary rights and could not have its flow impeded. It was a standard agreement for the time. However, she also found a more recent letter, dated 10 years ago, from a lawyer representing Elias's younger brother, Marcus Thorne, whose ranch lay downstream. The letter was a blustering, threatening document, asserting that Marcus had senior rights and that any damming or significant irrigation by Elias would be met with legal action. There was no mention of the original agreement. Elias, she guessed, had either forgotten the old document or had been worn down by his brother's aggression and the threat of a costly legal battle he couldn't afford. She knew about Marcus Thorne. His name was spoken infrequently and with a sour taste by the hands. He was the black sheep, the one who had demanded his inheritance early and left, only to return and buy the neighboring property, seemingly with the sole purpose of making his older brother's life miserable. The hand said he was all hat and no cattle, a man of bluster and entitlement. Billy had told her that Marcus had been diverting more and more of the creek for his own herd, leaving Stony Creek a shallow, sluggish stream by late summer, impacting Elias's own grazing. Cora sat back in the chair, the document spread before her like a battle map. This was more than just bookkeeping. This was the ammunition Elias needed to fight back. But presenting it required care. It was an indictment of his own management, a revelation of how he had been both cheated and bullied. A proud man could easily see it as an insult, not a help. She chose her moment carefully. It was a Sunday, a day when the work was lighter. The men were mostly occupied with their own affairs. Elias was on the porch, repairing a broken bridle, his hands moving with slow, accustomed skill. Cora brought him a cup of coffee. He took it with a nod of thanks. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice calm and even, "I believe I've found some discrepancies in the books, and something else I think you need to see." He stopped his work, his attention caught by her serious tone. "Discrepancies? I think it would be better if I showed you," she said. He followed her into the office. She had cleared the desk, leaving only her summary sheet, a stack of Dawson Mercantile's invoices, the old catalog, and the water rights document. She did not speak. She simply gestured for him to sit. He did, his brow furrowed with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. She walked him through it, step by step. She didn't use accusatory language. She presented the facts as a simple, unavoidable conclusion drawn from the evidence. "Here is the price Henderson charged you for 10 sacks of oats in April," she said, pointing to the invoice. "And here is the listed price from the Johnson & Smith catalog for that same month. The difference is $4. She moved to the next item, and the next, her finger tracing the path of the theft. Elias Thorne was silent. He leaned over the papers, his face growing harder and colder with each new revelation. The weariness in his eyes was being burned away by a slow-building fire of rage. He had trusted Henderson. He had known the man for 20 years. He had considered him a friend of a sort. To see the betrayal laid out in such stark, undeniable numbers was like a physical blow. "The son of a bitch," he whispered, the words tight with fury. He looked at the final tally she had calculated. The number was obscene. It was the price of his own misplaced trust. Cora let the silence sit for a moment before she pushed the other document toward him. "I also found this," she said gently. "In your father's papers. It's the original water rights filing for Stony Creek." He picked up the brittle paper, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. He read it, his eyes scanning the old-fashioned script. Then he read it again. A different kind of expression crossed his face now. It was not just anger. It was the dawning of a new, potent possibility. The legal threat from his brother, which had hung over him for a decade, was a bluff. A lie. He looked up at Cora. The lamplight caught the profound shock and dawning fury in his eyes. He saw not an employee, but a strategist. She had not just cleaned his house, she had armed his fortress. For a long moment, the point of view shifted, and he saw her not as the dusty, desperate woman who had arrived a month ago, but as a figure of immense strength and clarity. He had spent years fighting a war of attrition, slowly losing ground on all fronts. He fought with his fists and his back, the only ways he knew. But she fought with a scalpel, cutting to the heart of the rot with a precision he could only admire. She had seen the weaknesses in his kingdom that he himself was too close or too proud to notice. She was more than capable. She was formidable. He stood up and walked to the window, looking out into the darkness. "For 10 years, he said, his voice thick, "I've let him bleed me. Both of them. Henderson with his friendly smile and Marcus with his lawyers." He turned back to face her. The weariness was gone, replaced by a steely resolve she had never seen in him before. "That stops. Tomorrow." The next day, Elias Thorne rode into town. He did not go to the saloon or the general store. He went directly to the telegraph office. He sent 2 messages. The first was to a lawyer in Helena, a man his father had once used, a man known for being as relentless as a wolverine. The second was a simple 3-word message to Dawson Mercantile. "Contracts are void." When he returned to the ranch that evening, he was a different man. The weight was still on his shoulders, but he was carrying it differently now. He was no longer just enduring, he was fighting back. He found Cora in the kitchen, kneading dough for the next day's bread. "I spoke with the lawyer," he said, standing in the doorway. "He said the water rights agreement is ironclad. He's filing an injunction against Marcus tomorrow." He paused. "And I paid a visit to Henderson's competition. We have a new supplier, at a fair price." "Good," Cora said simply, not stopping her work. He watched her for a moment, the rhythmic push and fold of her hands in the dough. "I hired you to cook," he said, his voice quiet. "I thought that was what I needed." He shook his head slowly. "I was wrong. I needed a partner." The word hung in the warm, flower-dusted air. It was more than an apology for his initial skepticism. It was a confession. It was an admission that he could not do this alone. He told her then about the past betrayal that had made him so guarded. A former partner, years ago, who had stolen from him, not with doctored invoices, but by selling off cattle and pocketing the money. The man had been a friend, someone he'd trusted like a brother. The experience had walled him up inside himself, leaving him to run the ranch with a suspicious heart and a solitary spirit. Cora listened, her hands never ceasing their motion. She understood. Her own losses had taught her the fragility of trust, but they had also taught her the necessity of it. "Trust is a risk," she said when he had finished, "but so is trying to carry the whole world on your own shoulders." He nodded, a profound sadness in his eyes. "You have done more for this ranch in a month than I have in 5 years," he said. It was a stark and humbling admission. "I just organized the house," she replied. "You're the one who has to fight the war." A new level of trust was forged between them in that quiet moment, a bond that went far beyond employer and employee. It was a partnership, unspoken but deeply understood, formed in the shared understanding of loss and the mutual respect for competence. The ranch was still struggling, but for the first time in a long time, it had a fighting chance. And it was all because of the woman who had arrived with nothing but her dignity and a quiet, unshakable resolve. The first consequence of Elias's counteroffensive was silence. Marcus Thorne, served with a legal injunction that cited a document he likely never knew existed, did not bluster or threaten. He simply stopped his excessive drawing from the creek. The flow of water downstream from the ranch increased, a small but significant victory. Henderson, the supplier, sent a sputtering, indignant letter which Elias promptly used to light his pipe. The ranch was, for the first time in years, on a stable footing. The atmosphere in the bunkhouse lifted. The men worked with a lighter step, their talk filled with a new, unfamiliar optimism. But Cora knew that men like Marcus Thorne did not simply accept defeat. They nursed their grievances in silence, letting them fester until they erupted in a new and more venomous form. She saw it in the way Elias kept watching the horizon, the way he inspected the fences along the border with his brother's land with a grim intensity. A war had been declared, and this was just the first quiet battle. The real attack came with the first breath of winter. The autumn had been mild, a long, golden season that had lulled the valley into a false sense of security. But the old hands, like Silas, could read the signs. They saw the unusual thickness of the squirrels' coats, the way the migrating geese flew in tighter, more urgent formations. They sniffed the air and felt a different kind of cold in it, a deep predatory chill that promised a brutal winter. The forecast, when it finally arrived with the weekly mail wagon, was dire. A storm system, massive and potent, was sweeping down from the north. The old-timers called such storms White Death. They came on fast, dumped feet of snow in a matter of hours, and were accompanied by winds that could freeze a man solid in minutes. The news threw the ranch into a state of controlled urgency. The main herd was already in the sheltered winter pastures, but a small, valuable group of 24 pregnant heifers, the future of the herd, remained near the ranch. The plan had been to move them the following week. Now, it was a race against the storm. "We have to move them now," Elias announced at the hastily convened supper. "To the basin under Grayback Ridge. It's 5 miles, but it's the only place sheltered enough to see them through this. Jed, Billy, you're with me. We leave at first light." "The main barn should hold the rest," Jed said. "The studs are strong." Silas, who had been quiet, spoke up, his voice a low rasp. "The north roof, that main beam, it don't look right. Saw some new scoring on it the other day. Looked fresh. Elias frowned. Scoring? From what? Don't know, Silas said, shaking his head. Looked like a saw cut, not deep but in the wrong place. A cold knot formed in Cora's stomach. A saw cut. Fresh. She looked at Elias, and she saw the same suspicion dawn in his eyes. Marcus. It was the kind of petty, vicious sabotage he would favor. Not enough to bring the barn down on its own, but enough to weaken it, to make it vulnerable to the one thing he couldn't control but could certainly exploit, the weight of a heavy snow. We don't have time to fix it now, Elias said, his voice grim. Moving the heifers is priority. The barn will have to hold. Silas, you'll stay. Keep an eye on things here. The storm, however, did not wait for their schedule. It arrived that night, hours earlier than predicted. It came not as a gentle snowfall, but as a furious, roaring assault. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the windows of the house and driving the snow horizontally, a blinding white curtain that erased the world. Elias, Jed, and Billy were caught miles from the ranch, trapped with the heifers in the teeth of the blizzard. They were cut off. Cora stood at the window of the main house, peering into the maelstrom. She could barely see the outline of the barn, a dark, hulking shape against the white fury. The wind howled with a physical force, and she could feel the old house groaning under the strain. Inside, Leo was asleep, oblivious to the war being waged by the elements outside. The only other souls on the ranch were herself, the old man Silas, and the handful of remaining cattle and horses sheltered in the potentially compromised barn. Elias was trapped. The ranch was vulnerable, and the weight of the snow was beginning to pile up on the weakened roof. The threat was no longer a matter of ledgers and legal papers. It was here, and it was deadly. Around midnight, Silas appeared at the kitchen door, his face caked with snow, his eyes grim. "The beam," he said, his voice nearly drowned out by the wind. "It's starting to bow. I can hear the wood groaning. That roof ain't gonna last till morning." Cora's heart pounded. Inside that barn were the ranch's workhorses, the milk cow, and a dozen prime steers being fattened for sale, the ranch's entire operating capital for the next season. If the barn collapsed, the Stony Creek Ranch would be financially ruined. Elias would come back to a catastrophe from which he could not recover. Panic was a clawing thing at the edge of her thoughts. The sheer, overwhelming force of the storm, the darkness, the cold, the isolation, it was a recipe for despair. She could do nothing. She could huddle in the house, keep her son safe, and pray for morning. It was the sensible thing to do. It was the helpless thing to do. But Cora Halloran had long ago stopped doing the helpless thing. She looked at Silas, his old face etched with worry. She looked toward the room where her son slept. She thought of Elias and the men fighting for their own survival out in the blizzard. This ranch, this hard, unforgiving place, had given her a sanctuary when she had none. It had become something that felt perilously close to home, and she would not stand by and watch it be destroyed. "Get the lanterns," she said, her voice cutting through the howl of the wind with a sharp, clear authority. "And all the rope you can find. We're getting them out." Silas stared at her, his eyes wide in the flickering lamplight. "Out? Out where? Into this?" He gestured toward the storm. "It'll kill them. It'll kill us." "It will kill them for certain if that roof comes down," she countered, her mind already working, formulating a plan out of the desperate chaos. "We can't move them far, but we don't have to." She pointed out the window, toward the space between the main house and the smaller, sturdier building that served as a smithy and workshop. "The house and the smithy create a windbreak. The snow is already drifting there, but the wind is less. We can build a corral, a temporary one, and the horses, the old stable behind the bunkhouse. It's small, but the roof is sound." It was a desperate, almost insane plan. To move panicked animals in the middle of a blizzard, in the dead of night, with only an old man for help. But it was a plan, and a plan was better than a prayer. Silas looked at her, at the fierce, unwavering resolve in her eyes. He saw the same woman who had walked into the creek to face down a raging bull. He had lived a long life, and he knew competence when he saw it. He gave a single, sharp nod. "I'll get the ropes." Cora pulled on a heavy coat of Elias's that she found hanging by the door. She wrapped a scarf around her face and pulled on thick leather gloves. She took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She was no longer just the cook, the bookkeeper. Tonight, she was the commander of a besieged fortress. She stepped out into the storm, the wind hitting her like a solid wall, and moved toward the groaning barn, her lantern held out before her like a defiant star in the heart of the tempest. The inside of the barn was an eerie landscape of sound and shadow. The wind shrieked through the cracks in the walls, and a fine dust of snow sifted down from the roof. High above, in the gloom of the rafters, the main beam groaned under the accumulating weight of the snow, a deep, resonant sound, like a dying beast. The animals were restless, their fear a palpable thing in the cold air. The horses stamped and snorted in their stalls, their eyes wide and white in the lantern light. The steers shifted and lowed, a mournful chorus against the storm's fury. Silas met her just inside the massive sliding door, his arms laden with coils of rope. "It's worse than I thought," he shouted over the wind. "That wood is splintering. We ain't got much time." Cora's mind worked with a cold, swift clarity. Panic was a fire that would consume them. Logic was their only shield. "The horses first," she commanded. "They're the most likely to bolt. We'll take them to the old stable. Then we'll use the gates from their stalls to build the corral for the steers." It was a plan born of pure, practical genius. The stall gates were heavy, solid wood. Unhinged, they could be lashed together to form a makeshift fence. It was a staggering amount of work, but it was possible. They worked in a bubble of focused desperation. The storm raged around them, a monstrous, indifferent force. But within the circle of their lamplight, there was only the task at hand. Cora, moving with the quiet confidence of someone who had handled horses her whole life, went to the first stall. She spoke in a low, calming murmur, the same tone she had used on the bull. The horse, a big roan gelding, was trembling, but her steady voice and confident hands seemed to soothe its terror. She slipped a halter over its head and led it out into the maelstrom. The journey to the old stable, a distance of no more than 50 yards, was a brutal battle. The wind tore at them, trying to rip the lead rope from her frozen hands. The snow was already knee-deep, and the horse fought her, wanting to turn and run back to the familiar, if failing, shelter of the barn. But Cora held on, her feet braced, her body a stubborn anchor against the animal's panic and the storm's rage. She was not stronger than the horse, but she was smarter and more determined. She got the gelding into the small, secure stable, then turned and fought her way back to the barn for the next one. While she moved the horses one by one in a series of grueling, repetitive struggles, Silas worked with a feverish energy that belied his age. Using a crowbar, he pried the heavy iron hinges of the stall gates from their posts. The screech of tortured metal was barely audible over the wind, but each gate that came free was a small victory. After the last horse was secured, Cora joined him. Together, they began the Herculean task of dragging the heavy gates out into the blizzard. Each one was a dead weight, and the wind fought them for every inch. They positioned the first gate between the corner of the house and the smithy, using the buildings themselves as two sides of the corral. They lashed it in place with rope, their fingers clumsy and numb with cold. Then they dragged the next gate, and the next, lashing them together, slowly, painstakingly enclosing a space. It was brutal, mind-numbing work. The cold was a physical pain, seeping through their coats and gloves. Their muscles screamed in protest. More than once, the wind caught a gate and sent them sprawling into the snow. But they got up, brushed the snow from their faces, and went back to it. They were fueled by a shared, unspoken resolve. They were a team, an unlikely partnership of an old man and a widow, fighting a war on behalf of the man who was not there. As they worked, Cora's mind kept returning to the sound of the groaning beam. It was a death clock, ticking down the minutes they had left. She thought of Elias, and a strange, fierce protectiveness rose in her. He had given her a chance when no one else would. He had trusted her. He had called her a partner. She would not let him come home to ruin. This was more than just saving cattle. This was saving him. Finally, the makeshift corral was complete, a rough square of wood and rope sheltered in the lee of the buildings. It looked fragile, a pathetic defense against the storm, but it was all they had. Now came the most dangerous part, moving the steers. They opened the main barn door just enough to let the steers out one at a time. The animals, smelling the fresh cold air and sensing a change, were hesitant at first. Then, driven by the instinct to flee the groaning, unstable structure, they began to move. The first steer bolted out into the snow, saw the open space, and began to run. "Head him off!" Cora yelled, and she and Silas plunged into the deep snow, using their bodies and the waving lanterns to haze the panicked animal toward the opening of their new corral. It was a chaotic, terrifying dance in the blinding snow. The steers were big, powerful, and scared. But Cora and Silas moved with a desperate, coordinated grace, anticipating the animals' movements, turning them back, guiding them toward the makeshift shelter. One by one, they funneled the 12 steers into the pen. The last one was in. Silas slammed the final gate shut and lashed it with the last of their rope. The animals milled inside, confused and cold, but they were out of the barn. They were safe. Exhausted, soaked to the bone, and trembling with cold and exertion, Cora and Silas leaned against the wall of the house, their breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. They had done it. They had accomplished the impossible. And then, as if on cue, a sound tore through the night, a sound louder and more terrible than the wind. It was a deep, catastrophic crack, followed by a prolonged, deafening roar of splintering wood and collapsing weight. They turned and watched in horror as the roof of the main barn, which had stood for 50 years, gave way. It did not fall in one piece. It buckled in the middle, right where Silas had seen the sabotaged beam, and then the entire structure imploded, collapsing in on itself in a massive cloud of snow and splintered timber. Silence followed, a sudden shocking void where the barn had been. The place where the cattle had been standing only minutes before was now a tomb of twisted wood and heavy snow. If they had waited, if they had hesitated, if they had chosen the sensible, helpless path, everything would have been lost. Cora stared at the wreckage, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked at the huddled steers in their flimsy corral. She looked at Silas, his face a mask of shock and grim satisfaction. They had not been defeated. They had won. It was not a victory of force, but of intelligence, of courage, of the sheer stubborn refusal to surrender. The storm raged on, but its power over them was broken. The worst had happened, and they had met it and beaten it. Cora felt a wave of exhaustion so profound it was dizzying, but beneath it was a bedrock of fierce, triumphant pride. She had faced down the blizzard and the treachery of a bitter man, and she had protected this place. She had protected her home. 2 days later, the storm broke. The sun rose on a world transformed, buried under a pristine, silent blanket of white. And into that silence rode 3 figures, haggard and frostbitten, but alive. Elias, Jed, and Billy had weathered the storm in the lee of Grayback Ridge, and they were returning, fearing the worst. From a distance, Elias saw it. The collapsed barn, a gaping wound in the heart of his ranch. His heart sank, a cold, heavy stone of despair. He had failed. The storm and his brother had beaten him. He urged his tired horse forward, his face a grim mask, preparing himself for the full scope of the ruin. But as he got closer, he saw something that made him pull his horse to a sudden stop. He saw the horses, safe in the old stable. He saw the steers, huddled but alive, in a strange makeshift corral next to the house. And then he saw the 2 figures who had come out onto the porch to meet him, the old man, Silas, and the woman, Cora Halloran. He slid from his saddle, his legs unsteady, and walked toward them, his eyes fixed on the impossible scene. He looked at the wreckage of the barn, then at the saved animals. He looked at Cora's face, pale and drawn with exhaustion, but her eyes were clear and steady. He understood, in a sudden, breathtaking rush, what had happened here. He stopped in front of her. He had no words. Jed and Billy came up behind him, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. It was Silas who spoke, his voice rough but clear in the still morning air. The beam gave way, just like I said it would. He pointed a gnarled finger toward the wreckage. Marcus's handiwork. The snow was too heavy for it. He then looked at Cora. She got him out, all of them, built that corral in the teeth of it. Elias stared at Cora. He saw everything in that moment, the desperate arrival, the quiet competence, the shrewd intelligence, and now this act of impossible courage and loyalty. She had not just saved his cattle, she had saved his future. She had saved him from the ruin that had been stalking him for years. Just then, Marcus Thorne rode into the yard. He was dressed in a fine winter coat, his face arranged in an expression of faux concern. "Elias, my God, I just saw the barn. What a terrible tragedy. If there's anything I can do—" His voice trailed off as he took in the scene. He saw the live cattle. He saw the grim faces of the men. His eyes darted from the collapsed barn to the makeshift corral, and a flicker of disbelief and fury crossed his face before he could mask it. His plan had failed. "The beam was cut, Marcus," Elias said, his voice dangerously soft. He took a step toward his brother. "A fresh cut, weakened just enough for the snow to do your dirty work for you." "That's a ridiculous accusation," Marcus blustered, but his voice lacked conviction. "Silas saw you," Elias continued, his voice as cold as the snow around them. "Near the barn, 3 days ago, snooping around where you had no business being." All eyes turned to Silas. The old man, who rarely spoke more than 2 words at a time, now held the fate of Marcus Thorne in his hands. His word was known throughout the valley as being as solid as bedrock. Silas met Marcus's panicked gaze. "I saw him," Silas said, his voice carrying with absolute certainty. "Saw him slip out of the barn near dusk. Thought it was queer at the time." The denial died on Marcus's lips. He was trapped. There were no lawyers here, no blustering threats that could save him. There was only the quiet, damning testimony of an honest man and the undeniable evidence of his failed treachery. He was exposed, his character laid bare for all to see. He had been defeated not by violence, but by the truth, and by the competence of the woman he had never even considered a threat. Without another word, defeated and disgraced, Marcus Thorne turned his horse and rode away, a pariah in his own valley. His power was broken, not in a courtroom, but in a snowy ranch yard, in the court of community opinion, from which there was no appeal. In the quiet days that followed the storm, a new reality settled over the Stony Creek Ranch. The wreckage of the old barn was a stark reminder of the battle that had been fought and won, but the prevailing atmosphere was not one of loss, but of profound, bone-deep relief and a sense of renewal. The work of rebuilding began, not just the physical structure of the barn, but the spirit of the place. One evening, a week after the storm, Elias found Cora in the office. She was at the desk, not with the ledgers, but with a piece of paper and a pencil, sketching. He stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment. The lamplight softened the weary lines around her eyes and highlighted the focused intensity of her expression. "What are you drawing?" he asked quietly. She looked up, not startled. "A new barn," she said simply. She turned the paper toward him. It was not a vague sketch. It was a detailed plan. She'd redesigned the layout for greater efficiency, with a central feeding passage to save labor, a dedicated insulated calving stall, and a loft designed for better ventilation. It was the design of someone who understood not just the structure of a building, but the workflow of a ranch. He came and stood beside her, looking down at the drawing. He saw the logic in it, the intelligence, the foresight. It was better than the old barn had ever been. It was a plan for the future. He pulled up a chair and sat down beside her, a rare thing for him to do. The kitchen table was their usual place for difficult conversations, but the office had become her territory, a place of strategy and quiet power. "Cora," he began, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. He looked at his own calloused hands resting on the desk. "When you arrived here, I saw a woman at the end of her rope. I saw a burden. I've never been more wrong about anything in my life." He finally looked at her, and his eyes, those gray stones, were clear and filled with a raw, unguarded sincerity. "I hired a cook. That's what I told myself I needed, someone to handle the small things so I could handle the big ones." He shook his head, a small, self-deprecating gesture. "The truth is, I was failing at all of it. The ranch was dying, and I was too proud and too tired to see it. What this place needed wasn't just a cook or a bookkeeper. It needed a heart. It needed a mind sharper than my own. It needed you." Cora listened, her own hand still on the drawing of the new barn. Her journey to this place had been one of stripping away, her husband, her home, her security. She had been reduced to her core, to the essential skills and the unbending will that loss had forged in her. And here, in this last desperate place, that core had been seen and valued for what it was. "We needed each other, Elias," she said softly. "This ranch needed all of us." "No," he said, his voice firm. "It needed a leader. And when I was trapped, when I had already failed, you led. You saved this place. You saved me." He took a deep breath, the words of a man who did not speak easily of such things. "My offer of 30 days. It was a probationary arrangement, a trial." He paused, and a faint, almost smile touched his lips. "I think the trial is over." He reached across the desk and put his hand over hers, his rough, warm palm covering her fingers where they rested on the plans for the future. "This is not just my ranch anymore, Cora. It hasn't been for a while. It's ours. I want to make it formal, a partnership, half of everything, the land, the cattle, the debts, and the future. Your name next to mine on the deed. This is your home, if you'll have it." It was not a proposal of marriage, not in the traditional sense. It was something deeper, something more profound. It was an offer of absolute equality, of a shared life built on a foundation of mutual respect and proven competence. It was the ultimate acknowledgement of her worth. Cora looked at their hands, his large and weathered, hers smaller but no less strong, joined together over the blueprint of their future. She thought of the long, dusty road that had brought her here. She had arrived as a widow seeking refuge. She was now being asked to stay as a queen in a kingdom she had helped to save. She accepted, not with the relief of a desperate woman, but with the quiet, joyful dignity of a partner. "Yes," she said, "I'll have it." Small. The final scene unfolded, not in a moment of high drama, but in the quiet domesticity of a late spring afternoon, 6 months later. The harshness of winter had given way to the tender green of new life. The frame of the new barn stood against the sky, a skeleton of fresh-cut pine, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and progress. The men, Jed included, worked with a purpose and camaraderie that had been absent for years. Jed, humbled and ultimately won over by the undeniable positive changes, now treated Cora with a gruff but genuine respect. Cora was on her knees in the rich soil of a newly tilled garden beside the main house. She was planting rows of seeds, her hands moving with the same methodical grace she applied to all her work. This small patch of earth was her own, a place for tomatoes and beans and herbs, a promise of flavor and nourishment. A small sound made her look up. Leo was running across the yard, laughing. It was a sound that had been absent for so long, a pure, bubbling peal of joy that was more beautiful than any bird song. He was chasing a small, scruffy puppy that Billy had found for him, and his face, once a mask of silent watchfulness, was alive with uncomplicated happiness. He was no longer a witness to tragedy. He was a participant in joy. On the porch of the house, Elias Thorne sat in his father's old rocking chair, smoking his pipe. He was not watching the construction of the barn. He was watching the woman in the garden and the boy in the yard. The deep lines of weariness on his face had softened. The guarded look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound contentment. He was a man who had been besieged in his own fortress for a decade, and he was finally at peace. He looked at the thriving ranch, at the loyal crew, at the laughing boy. He looked at Cora, her head bent to her task, a figure of strength and serenity who had brought order out of his chaos and hope out of his despair. The Stony Creek Ranch had been a piece of property he was struggling to hold on to. It was now a home. He had thought what he needed was a good hand to help him fight his battles. What he got was the woman who made the fight worthwhile.